The decree from Washington arrived with the force of a hammer, though its instrument was only paper. A 50% tariff on Burkina Faso shea butter may sound like an ordinary adjustment of trade, but in truth it struck at the very marrow of the nation's economy. For Burkina Faso, also referred to by some as Burkina Faso or Burkina Faso, shea butter is not simply a commodity. It is the heartbeat of the countryside, the harvest of countless villages, and the livelihood of women whose hands know no rest from dawn until nightfall. To understand the weight of this blow, one must first look at the numbers. Nearly 94% of households across the country engage in the gathering of shea nuts, whether as their main occupation or a seasonal source of income. More than 60% of families sell shea in one form or another: raw nuts, processed butter, or finished cosmetic products. In good years, the nation harvests more than 600,000 tons of shea nuts, though only a fraction enters international markets. Still, that fraction alone brought in around $60 million annually, a crucial sum for a landlocked nation where revenue from cotton, livestock, and gold already faces volatility. The sudden imposition of tariffs therefore meant more than higher prices. It meant broken contracts, delayed shipments, and warehouses filled with butter that exporters could no longer afford to move. Traders in Ouagadougou reported that shipments bound for the United States were halted at ports, their cargo now devalued overnight. Farmers in the savannah villages stood stunned as buyers withdrew, unwilling to take risks under the new regime. For women's cooperatives, the backbone of the shea sector, the news was devastating. Their carefully negotiated deals with international cosmetics firms crumbled in a matter of days. Washington gave no prior warning. No delegation arrived to negotiate terms. No letter of concern was sent in advance. Instead, the decree was issued abruptly, as though Burkina Faso were too small to merit dialogue. American officials justified the measure as part of a broader recalibration of agricultural imports. Yet to many Africans, the message was clear. This was a political act, a punitive gesture directed not at shea trees, but at the nation's leadership. At the center of this storm stood Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain who had risen to power with bold promises of restoring sovereignty. His government had already taken steps that unsettled Western powers, strengthening ties with Moscow, courting Beijing through what international headlines labeled the Traoré-China pivot, and announcing a $2.1 billion trade deal that shifted the balance of African commerce. For Washington, this was no small matter. To strike at shea was to strike at Traoré's political base, a signal that the world's superpowers still sought to control Africa's economic arteries. But here is where the narrative shifts from statistics to symbolism. Shea butter is not only a line in the ledger, it is culture, history, and survival. For centuries, women have gathered beneath the shade of shea trees, passing down techniques of processing from grandmother to granddaughter. The butter has healed wounds, softened skin, and fed generations. When that butter is taxed into scarcity, it is not only revenue that is lost, it is dignity, identity, and hope. Burkina Faso's response in those first hours was one of shock. Government spokesmen condemned the decree as unjust and discriminatory. Civil society groups called it an act of economic aggression. In the marketplaces of Ouagadougou, women spoke with quiet anger, their voices carrying a mix of grief and defiance. "Why should our labor be punished?" one cooperative leader asked. "We work the earth, we feed our families. Do they fear us so much that they must silence our butter?" This was not merely a tariff, it was the opening of a fault line that could reshape African politics. By targeting the product most closely tied to women, the decree risked fueling unrest across rural communities. And by undermining Burkina Faso's trade, it sent a chilling signal to other nations that dared pursue independent policies. Still, for every blow, there is an echo. Even as shipments stalled, voices began to rise. Some called for the redirection of exports to Asia, especially China, which had already expressed interest in deeper agricultural ties. Others urged the African Union to respond collectively, framing the decree not as a bilateral dispute, but as an assault on the continent's economic sovereignty. The very phrase, African economic sovereignty, echoed across commentaries and speeches, transforming what might have been a local crisis into a continental cause. For ordinary citizens, The decree became a story repeated at water pumps, in buses, in the long lines at Ouagadougou's bakeries. That one piece of paper in Washington could bring hardship to millions in West Africa. It was a reminder that Africa's place in the global economy remained fragile, vulnerable to distant pens held by foreign hands. And yet, as dusk fell on that first week of August, there was a sense that something greater was stirring. This was not the end of the shea story. It was the beginning of a larger confrontation. But this was only the first domino to fall, and soon the world would see that Burkina Faso's silence could turn into a thunderous roar. In the days that followed, the silence in Burkina Faso gave way to voices rising like a tide. The decree from Washington had landed not as an abstract policy, but as a personal wound, felt in the rhythm of daily life. For the women who cracked the shea nuts and churned the butter, the tariff meant canceled payments. For the traders at Ouagadougou's bustling markets, it meant goods piling unsold. For the young men driving lorries toward Ghana's ports, it meant journeys aborted midway, their cargo now worthless under the new tax. And yet, what struck deepest was not only the financial injury, but the feeling of disrespect. Burkina Faso, long accustomed to being treated as a pawn in global games, now saw its sovereignty mocked by a distant decree. Outrage brewed, spreading from villages to city streets until it poured out into public squares. Demonstrations erupted in Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, and Kaya. Banners appeared, hand-painted in French and Moray. No to economic war. Respect our butter, respect our women. Amid the chants, Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward. On the 6th of August, standing beneath the glare of cameras, he delivered what quickly became known as the Ibrahim Traoré speech. His words were not measured diplomacy, but a fiery defense of dignity. "They have taxed not our exports, but our spirit," he declared, his voice echoing through the square. "They wish to remind us that Africa must always kneel. But I tell you this, we shall not kneel, we shall rise. Our shea is not theirs to command, our sovereignty is not theirs to deny." The crowd thundered in approval. Some wept. Others raised fists to the sky. The speech was broadcast across Africa, replayed on radio stations from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Within hours, international outlets, Africa News, Al Jazeera, BBC Africa, carried headlines about a new defiance in the Sahel. The emotional climax of those days was not confined to words. Reports emerged of women in villages, forming human chains around shea trees, singing ancestral songs of resistance. They declared that these trees, symbols of fertility and survival, would not be allowed to become collateral in an international trade war. For many, this was not about economics, but about heritage, about refusing to let foreign decrees uproot traditions stretching back centuries. The government of Burkina Faso took further action. Traoré's ministers announced emergency measures to stabilize the market, promising to purchase shea stocks directly from cooperatives to prevent collapse. Talks opened with China, hinting at new buyers who could replace the lost American demand. International observers quickly labeled this a Traoré trade deal in the making, a bold gamble that could alter the continent's commercial map. The reaction abroad was swift and divided. In Washington, officials insisted the tariff was a regulatory necessity, denying any political motive. Yet the timing, coming only weeks after Traoré's China pivot, was too conspicuous for many to ignore. European commentators warned that the United States was pushing Africa further into Beijing's embrace. In Moscow, state media framed the crisis as proof of Western hypocrisy. In Beijing, a spokesperson warmly described Burkina Faso as a resilient partner and hinted at new avenues for agricultural cooperation. On African soil, solidarity surged. The African Union convened an emergency session, while ECOWAS debated whether to issue a formal condemnation. Leaders from Mali, Niger, and Ghana expressed support for Burkina Faso, some calling for a united front against what they termed economic intimidation. On social media, hashtags spread, Jush Shea Diplomacy, Jush Africa Rise, Jush US-Africa Tension. The story had leapt beyond trade into the realm of political identity. It was in these reactions, the protests, the speeches, the songs, that the true climax of the crisis took form. The United States may have intended to pressure a government, but instead it had awakened a continent-wide conversation about dignity, dependence, and the price of freedom. The emotional palette of the nation shifted in those weeks, from shock to anger, from anger to defiance. As the fires of protest lit up the night in Ouagadougou, an elder was heard telling a reporter, "We buried colonialism once. If they try to return through our markets, we will bury it again." For observers across Africa, it became clear that what was unfolding in Burkina Faso was not merely a quarrel over shea butter. It was a struggle for the soul of African politics. Would the continent continue to bow to external dictates, or would this crisis mark the first chapter in reclaiming its own economic destiny? And as the dust of protest settled, one question remained unanswered. What would be the deeper consequences, civilian, economic, and political, that this single decree had unleashed across the land? When the chants faded and the banners were rolled up, the true cost of Washington's decree began to surface in homes, villages, and markets across Burkina Faso. The tariff on shea butter exports was not only a matter for diplomats or economists, it was a wound felt in kitchens, in schools, and in the fragile budgets of ordinary families. For women in the cooperatives, the decree struck like a drought. Many had spent months collecting shea nuts, drying them in the sun, and pressing them into butter with tools handed down from mothers and grandmothers. Contracts signed with international buyers, especially American cosmetic firms, collapsed overnight. Payments that were expected never arrived. For some women, it meant the inability to buy medicine for a sick child. For others, it meant pulling daughters out of school because fees could no longer be met. Shea had always been the currency of dignity for rural women. Without it, their independence crumbled. In the countryside, where nearly 94% of households engage in shea gathering, the decree caused shockwaves. Families who had long relied on seasonal sales now found their harvest rotting in storage huts. Traders who usually traveled by lorry to Ghana or Ivory Coast halted their journeys as cross-border prices plummeted. The shea tree itself, once seen as a tree of life, now stood as a bitter reminder of vulnerability in the face of foreign power. Politically, the decree had an unexpected effect. Rather than weakening Ibrahim Traoré, it fortified his standing. The young leader, already seen by many as a symbol of defiance, now became the rallying point for national unity. Citizens who had been lukewarm about his government found themselves rallying behind him, not out of blind loyalty, but out of a shared sense of injury. His fiery denunciations of economic warfare resonated deeply. In Parliament, opposition parties struggled to criticize him without appearing to side with Washington. What was meant to be a pressure point had, ironically, reinforced his legitimacy. But the political consolidation came with social risks. Across Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, resentment toward America hardened. Anti-Western graffiti appeared on walls, and student groups staged boycotts of Western-funded programs. Civil society leaders warned that the crisis could fuel radicalization, as disenfranchised youth found easy targets for their frustration. "If a pen in Washington can starve us," one university student said bitterly, "then why should we believe in their promises of democracy?" The decree also deepened discussions about African economic sovereignty. Intellectuals, journalists, and activists began openly questioning whether reliance on Western markets had become a trap. Newspapers carried headlines such as "Shea Diplomacy and the Price of Dependence" and "A Lesson in Sovereignty Paid in Butter." Radio hosts debated whether Burkina Faso should ban raw shea exports altogether and invest in local industries to produce finished cosmetics, thus capturing more value within Africa. The short-term consequences were harsh: rising unemployment, declining household income, and a surge in food insecurity. Yet within these hardships, a seed of long-term transformation was being planted. Some analysts argued that the tariff, however painful, might push Burkina Faso to diversify its markets and strengthen intra-African trade. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, was cited as an opportunity, though critics questioned whether regional infrastructure was ready to absorb such a shift. Internationally, the decree also stirred debate about fairness. Humanitarian organizations warned that punishing an export dominated by women workers amounted to punishing gender equality itself. Editorials in African news described the tariff as a blow against African women dressed in the language of trade. The symbolism was potent. A continent long associated with exploitation now faced economic humiliation over a product deeply tied to female empowerment. Within Burkina Faso, the decree became a daily conversation. In the markets, women asked whether their butter would ever find buyers again. In the mosques and churches, prayers were offered not only for rain, but for justice. At family gatherings, elders reminded the young that Africa had survived greater trials before, and would again. Perhaps the most profound consequence was psychological. The decree reminded Burkina-based citizens that their destiny remained tethered to foreign pens. Yet in the same breath, it sparked a hunger to break free from that tether. For many, it became clear that sovereignty was not an abstract speech, but a necessity measured in the price of food, school fees, and medicine. And so, the shea butter crisis evolved into something larger than trade. It became a mirror reflecting Africa's place in the global order, and a question whispered across the continent. Would Africa forever react to the world's decrees, or would it one day write its own? Do you believe this was the moment Africa began to rise against economic chains? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice is part of this story. Yet even as Burkina Faso struggled with its wounds, the world beyond Africa's borders began to weigh in, sometimes with sympathy, sometimes with scorn, and sometimes with open rivalry. While the decree shook Burkina Faso from within, it also reverberated across the global stage. What Washington presented as a matter of trade regulation quickly evolved into a flashpoint in African politics, exposing fractures and alliances that stretched far beyond Ouagadougou. In the United States, officials defended the 50% tariff as a technical correction to protect American industries. They framed it as part of a broader agricultural review, avoiding any mention of Ibrahim Traoré or his pivot toward Asia. Yet behind closed doors, analysts and journalists alike noted the timing. Only weeks before, Traoré had signed a $2.1 billion trade pivot that opened Burkina Faso's markets to Beijing. To many, the tariff was less about butter and more about power, a warning that Washington still intended to dictate the terms of African commerce. The reaction from Europe was cautious. The European Union expressed concern about disproportionate measures, but stopped short of directly criticizing the United States. Some European commentators suggested the crisis revealed a deeper anxiety, that Africa, long seen as Europe's backyard, was slipping steadily toward new patrons. France, still nursing its diminished influence in West Africa, found itself in an awkward position, silent on Washington's decree but uneasy about the growing popularity of Traoré. China, meanwhile, seized the opportunity. State media declared that Beijing stood with Burkina Faso and emphasized the resilience of China-Africa partnership. Offers of new contracts for shea butter flowed almost immediately, with Chinese firms proposing to purchase stocks left stranded by American buyers. Commentators spoke of shea diplomacy, the notion that a humble nut could symbolize the broader contest between great powers for Africa's allegiance. Russia also chimed in, framing the tariff as another example of Western hypocrisy. Moscow's broadcasters praised Traoré's defiance and urged Africans to stand against imperialist economic chains. Though Russia's capacity to absorb Burkina Faso's shea exports was limited, its political rhetoric found eager listeners in the Sahel. On the African continent itself, the reaction was striking. The African Union convened a special session in Addis Ababa, where leaders debated whether the tariff represented a bilateral quarrel or a continental challenge. ECOWAS members voiced solidarity, with Ghana, Mali, and Niger criticizing Washington's unilateral approach. Commentators across Africa news and regional outlets described the decree as an insult not only to Burkina Faso, but to Africa's collective dignity. The phrase African economic sovereignty appeared repeatedly in op-eds, transforming a local dispute into a symbol of continental struggle. Ordinary Africans, too, weighed in. On social media, hashtags such as US-Africa tension and Africa trade war gained traction. Memes compared shea nuts to bullets, suggesting that the battle for Africa's future might be fought not on battlefields but in markets and contracts. Elders recalled past decades when trade terms were dictated by colonial powers. Younger activists argued this was proof that a new, self-reliant Africa must emerge. Thus, what began as a silent decree in Washington became a stage for global rivalry and local awakening. Each actor, America, Europe, China, Russia, and Africa itself, projected its own story onto the butter of the savannah. But as speeches echoed and alliances shifted, the most urgent question remained unanswered. What path would Africa itself choose? And what future awaited Burkina Faso in the storm of competing powers? As the storm of global voices swirled around Burkina Faso, one truth grew clearer. The ultimate choice lay not in Washington, Beijing, or Brussels, but in Africa itself. The tariff on Burkina Faso shea butter had revealed a continent's vulnerability, but it also unveiled a door to possibility. Three paths seemed visible on the horizon. The first was submission, returning quietly to American markets, negotiating concessions, and accepting dependency as the price of stability. Many elders, remembering the scars of past trade disputes, feared that confrontation would only bring more hardship. To them, the pragmatic choice was survival, even if it meant bowing once more to foreign dictates. The second path was confrontation, embracing what commentators began to call an Africa trade war. This would mean redirecting exports toward Asia, hardening alliances with China and Russia, and confronting the West openly. Advocates of this route spoke passionately about dignity, about breaking chains once and for all. They pointed to Ibrahim Traoré's fiery words as proof that a new generation of African leaders had the courage to resist. Yet critics warned that simply trading one dependency for another would not bring true liberation. The third and most ambitious path was self-reliance. This vision called for transforming Africa's raw materials within Africa's borders, capturing value through local industries rather than shipping unprocessed goods abroad. Under this scenario, the butter churned by women in Ouagadougou's cooperatives would not leave as bulk exports, but as finished lotions, soaps, and cosmetics proudly branded Made in Africa. This was not a short road. It required investment, education, and infrastructure. But it was the only path that could anchor long-term African economic sovereignty. For Traoré and his government, the choice was more than economic. It was existential. Could Burkina Faso become the test case for a continent determined to reclaim its dignity? Or would the pressures of geopolitics push it back into the cycle of dependency? His $2.1 billion trade deal with Beijing signaled boldness, but the true measure of his leadership would lie in whether he could build an economy that stood upright even without foreign buyers. Beyond Burkina Faso, the continent watched. From Nigeria to South Africa, debates raged about whether the shea crisis was a warning or a catalyst. Activists called for a united African market under the African Continental Free Trade Area, framing the tariff not as a burden, but as a lesson. Religious leaders reminded congregations that hardship often precedes deliverance. In village squares, young men and women repeated the new slogans, "Africa Rise! It's time for Africa!" The future was not yet written, but one fact was undeniable. A single decree from Washington had lit a fire across Africa, a fire that no foreign pen could extinguish. And so, as night fell over Ouagadougou, the question lingered in every household and every heart. What future will Africa choose, and how will history remember this battle over butter? From the silence of a single decree to the thunder of defiant voices, the shea butter crisis has unfolded as more than a story of tariffs. It has become a parable of Africa's struggle for dignity, sovereignty, and survival. What Washington framed as policy, Burkina Faso experienced as punishment. Yet from that punishment, something unexpected has emerged. A renewed determination to stand upright in the storms of global politics. For the women whose hands gather the nuts and churn the butter, the decree was a personal tragedy. But it was also a reminder that their labor, their traditions, and their products are the backbone of a nation, and perhaps of a continent's independence. For Ibrahim Traoré, it was both a trial and an opportunity, proof that leadership in Africa is no longer measured only by military strength, but by the courage to defend African economic sovereignty against the dictates of distant powers. The symbolism of Burkina Faso shea butter now stretches far beyond commerce. It has become a banner under which ordinary Africans, elders, and youth alike can imagine a future free of dependency. That future is not guaranteed. It requires bold investment, regional unity, and the will to transform resources at home. But it is no longer a distant dream. It is a demand rising from Ouagadougou to Addis Ababa, from Accra to Johannesburg. History may one day record this as a turning point, when a small landlocked nation reminded the world that Africa is not a passive supplier, but a continent with its own destiny. The shea tree, rooted in the soil of the savannah, may yet prove to be the tree that sheltered a new chapter of freedom. If this story stirs something in your chest, do not let it fade. Like, share, and subscribe, because Africa's silence has lasted too long. Now is the time to speak our future aloud. And to you, the viewer, we ask, will history remember this moment as a fleeting quarrel over butter, or as the spark that set a continent on fire? Your answer, your voice, belongs in the comments below. Suggested calls to action. New Africa, Africa Rise. Africa can do it. It's time for Africa.